The fog rolled thick across the Michigan wilderness on that October morning in 2023, casting ghostly shadows between the towering pines and ancient oaks that had stood sentinel for decades. Sarah Chen adjusted her hiking boots on the moss-covered log and wiped the condensation from her camera lens, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp autumn air. As an urban explorer and photographer documenting abandoned places across the Midwest, she had ventured into countless forgotten corners of America, but something about this particular stretch of forest felt different, charged with an energy she couldn't quite name. Her companion, Marcus Thompson, pushed through a tangle of wild grapevines that had grown so thick they formed an almost impenetrable wall of green. He was breathing heavily, his flannel shirt damp with morning dew and perspiration. They had been hiking for nearly 2 hours, following what appeared to be the remnants of an old logging road that had long since been reclaimed by nature. Marcus paused, consulting the hand-drawn map he had copied from historical records at the county courthouse, cross-referencing it with modern GPS coordinates. "We should be close," he called back to Sarah, his voice echoing strangely in the dense woodland. "According to the old forestry surveys, there's some kind of clearing about 50 yards northeast of here where logging equipment was abandoned in the 1960s. Sarah nodded, shouldering her camera bag and following Marcus deeper into the undergrowth. The forest floor was a carpet of fallen leaves in brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold, creating a natural mosaic that crunched softly beneath their feet. Somewhere overhead, a red-tailed hawk circled lazily, its cry piercing the morning stillness. The air smelled of decomposing leaves, rich earth, and something else, something metallic and old that Sarah couldn't immediately identify. As they pushed through another cluster of saplings, Marcus suddenly stopped so abruptly that Sarah nearly collided with him. He was staring at something ahead, his mouth slightly open, his face pale despite the morning chill. Sarah followed his gaze and felt her own breath catch in her throat. There, almost completely swallowed by 6 decades of unchecked forest growth, was the unmistakable silhouette of an automobile. Medium-sized oak trees had grown near it, their branches extending over the vehicle like protective arms. Thick curtains of wild honeysuckle draped over what had once been the roof, while saplings pushed through gaps in the rusted metal. The forest had claimed this machine so thoroughly that it appeared to be a natural part of the landscape, a strange hybrid of human engineering and organic growth. Sarah raised her camera with trembling hands, the professional photographer in her immediately recognizing the extraordinary nature of what they had discovered. The vehicle was clearly from the 1950s, its distinctive lines and chrome details still visible despite the decades of weathering and vegetation. As she adjusted her lens and began documenting the scene, she noticed something that made her heart race. A Michigan license plate, partially visible beneath a tangle of wild roses, the numbers barely legible after decades of exposure to the elements. Marcus moved closer to the vehicle, carefully pushing aside hanging vines and branches. The driver's side door hung open at an odd angle, its hinges long, since rusted beyond function. Inside the cabin, decades of leaves, twigs, and forest debris had accumulated, creating a miniature ecosystem within the confines of what had once been someone's pride and joy. Small plants had taken root in the accumulated organic matter, and Sarah could see the delicate tracery of spiderwebs stretched between the steering wheel and the dashboard. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the morning sounds of the forest. "Look at this." He was pointing to something on the dashboard, partially obscured by years of accumulated debris. Sarah moved closer, her camera clicking steadily as she documented every detail. There, weather-stained but still partially legible, was what appeared to be a business card or identification of some kind. The name was almost completely faded, but she could make out what looked like the word Motors, and possibly part of a Detroit address. As Sarah continued photographing, Marcus carefully began clearing. away some of the debris from around the vehicle. The more they uncovered, the more questions arose. This wasn't just an abandoned car. The way it was positioned, the open door, the location deep in the forest miles from any road, all suggested something more mysterious than a simple abandonment. The vehicle appeared to have been driven to this spot and then simply left, as if the driver had intended to return but never did. The morning sun climbed higher, sending dappled rays of golden light through the forest canopy and illuminating their extraordinary discovery. Sarah found herself wondering about the last person to sit behind that steering wheel, to grip those handles, to look through that windshield. What had brought them to this remote location? What had happened to them? And why had this automotive time capsule remained hidden for so long in the heart of the Michigan wilderness? As she framed another shot, focusing on the interplay of organic growth and mechanical decay, Sarah had no idea that they had stumbled upon one of Detroit's most enduring mysteries, a puzzle that had baffled investigators, tormented a family, and spawned countless theories for nearly 7 decades. The rusted hulk before them was more than just an abandoned automobile. It was a silent witness to a story of ambition, betrayal, and disappearance that had its roots in the golden age of American automotive manufacturing. The story began 68 years earlier, in the bustling, smoke-filled offices of Detroit's automotive district, where dreams were forged in steel and chrome, and fortunes were made and lost with each model year. It was a time when America was riding high on post-war prosperity, when the automobile represented freedom, progress, and the unlimited potential of the American dream. But for one man, that dream would become a nightmare that would echo through the decades. Robert William Hartley was the kind of man who seemed destined for success from the moment he drew his first breath in 1928. Born into a middle-class family in Cleveland, Ohio, he possessed the rare combination of technical brilliance, business acumen, and personal charisma that made him a natural fit for the rapidly expanding automotive industry. His father, a tool and die maker who had worked his way up from the factory floor to a supervisory position, instilled in young Robert a deep appreciation for both the artistry and precision required in automobile manufacturing. From an early age, Robert displayed an almost intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. While other children played with toy soldiers or marbles, he spent hours disassembling and reassembling anything mechanical he could get his hands on. Alarm clocks, radio sets, even the family's vacuum cleaner, much to his mother's consternation. By the age of 12, he could completely tear down and rebuild a bicycle. And by 17, he was helping local mechanics diagnose problems that had stumped more experienced technicians. His academic performance was equally impressive. Robert graduated as salutatorian from his Cleveland High School in 1945, earning a partial scholarship to study mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan. His professors were immediately struck by his ability to visualize complex three-dimensional problems and his knack for finding elegant solutions to seemingly intractable engineering challenges. Even as an undergraduate, he was contributing original research to faculty projects, and several of his innovations were eventually incorporated into production automobiles. The post-war boom years were an extraordinary time to be entering the automotive industry. American car manufacturers were struggling to meet pent-up consumer demand after years of wartime production restrictions, and bright young engineers like Robert Hartley were in high demand. Upon graduating summa cum laude in 1949, he was courted by all of the major Detroit automakers, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and several smaller companies that were hoping to carve out their own niches in the expanding market. Robert ultimately chose to join Consolidated Motors Corporation, a mid-sized company that specialized in producing affordable family sedans and light commercial vehicles. While not as prestigious as working for the Big Three automakers, Consolidated offered something that appealed to Robert's entrepreneurial spirit: the opportunity to have a significant impact on product development and potentially rapid advancement within the company hierarchy. He started as a junior engineer in the transmission design department, but his talents were quickly recognized by senior management. Within 18 months, he had been promoted twice and was leading a team of experienced engineers on a critical project to develop a new automatic transmission system that would give Consolidated a competitive advantage in the crucial mid-price market segment. Robert's personal life was equally successful during this period. In 1951, he married Catherine Mills, the daughter of a prominent Detroit attorney who had connections throughout the city's business and social establishments. Catherine was not only beautiful and intelligent, but also possessed the social skills and cultural refinement that complemented Robert's technical expertise perfectly. Their wedding was featured prominently in the Detroit Society pages, and the couple quickly became fixtures in the city's automotive elite social circle. Catherine had met Robert at a charity fundraiser for the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, where she was volunteering as an event coordinator, and he was attending as a guest of his supervisor at Consolidated Motors. She was immediately struck by his quiet confidence and his ability to discuss complex technical subjects in ways that made them accessible and interesting to people outside the engineering field. Robert, for his part, was captivated by Catherine's grace, intelligence, and genuine interest in his work and aspirations. Their courtship unfolded over several months of dinners, theater performances, and long walks through Detroit's Belle Isle Park. Catherine appreciated Robert's thoughtfulness. He would bring her small gifts that showed he had been listening to their conversations, such as a book by her favorite author, or tickets to a lecture by a speaker she had mentioned wanting to hear. Robert found in Catherine not just a romantic partner, but an intellectual companion who could challenge his ideas and offer perspectives that broadened his understanding of the world beyond engineering and manufacturing. By 1953, Robert had been promoted to Chief of Advanced Engineering at Consolidated Motors, making him one of the youngest people ever to hold such a senior position at the company. His annual salary of $15,000 placed him firmly in the upper middle class, and he and Catherine had purchased a beautiful colonial-style home in Grosse Pointe, complete with a circular driveway where Robert parked his pride and joy. A gleaming black 1951 Chevrolet Style Line Deluxe that he had customized with several performance modifications of his own design. The Chevrolet was more than just transportation for Robert. It was a rolling testament to his engineering philosophy and personal taste. He had spent countless evenings in his garage, fine-tuning the engine, upgrading the suspension system, and making subtle modifications that improved both performance and comfort. The car handled beautifully on winding roads and provided a smooth, quiet ride that impressed passengers and reflected Robert's attention to detail and craftsmanship. Catherine often joked that Robert loved that car more than he loved her, though she said it with affection rather than resentment. She understood that for her husband, the automobile represented everything he had worked to achieve: professional success, technical mastery, and the freedom to travel anywhere the roads would take him. On weekends, they would often take long drives through the Michigan countryside, exploring small towns and scenic byways, with Robert behind the wheel of his meticulously maintained Chevrolet. Their marriage appeared to be thriving during these early years. Catherine had given birth to their first child, Robert Jr., in 1952, and she was pregnant with their second child in 1955. They entertained regularly, hosting dinner parties for Robert's colleagues and business associates, and Catherine had become active in several charitable organizations that served Detroit's underprivileged communities. The young family seemed to embody the American dream of the 1950s. A successful professional man, his devoted wife, their growing family, and their comfortable suburban home. Neighbors and friends viewed the Hartleys as a model couple who had achieved the perfect balance between career success and domestic happiness. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, tensions were beginning to develop that would eventually tear everything apart. The automotive industry in the mid-1950s was becoming increasingly competitive, with profit margins under constant pressure, and companies fighting desperately for market share. Consolidated Motors, despite Robert's contributions to product development, was struggling to compete against the superior resources and marketing power of the major automakers. The company's financial position was becoming increasingly precarious, though this information was closely held by senior management and not widely known among employees or the general public. Internal company politics were becoming more complex as well. Robert's rapid rise through the corporate hierarchy had created some resentment among longer-tenured employees who felt passed over for promotions. There were whispers in the engineering department that Robert's success owed more to his social connections and his wife's family influence than to his actual technical abilities. While these accusations were largely unfounded, Robert's engineering innovations had genuinely improved Consolidated's products and saved the company significant amounts of money. They created an atmosphere of suspicion and rivalry that made Robert's job increasingly stressful. More troubling were the rumors beginning to circulate about financial irregularities within Consolidated Motors Corporation itself. The company had been aggressively expanding its operations, building new manufacturing facilities, and investing heavily in research and development projects. Some industry observers were questioning whether Consolidated had overextended itself financially, taking on more debt than it could reasonably service given its market position. Robert, in his role as Chief of Advanced Engineering, had access to detailed financial information about the company's operations, including sensitive data about development costs, profit margins, and future product planning. He was also privy to high-level strategic discussions about potential mergers, acquisitions, and partnerships that could dramatically affect Consolidated's future prospects. As 1955 progressed, Robert began to notice discrepancies in the financial reports he was receiving. Project budgets seemed to be inflated beyond what he knew the actual development costs to be, and money that had been allocated for specific engineering initiatives appeared to be disappearing without explanation. When he raised these concerns with his immediate supervisor, he was told that the financial details were being handled at a higher level and that he should focus on the technical aspects of his responsibilities. But Robert's engineering mind was trained to identify problems and find solutions, and he couldn't ignore what appeared to be systematic financial manipulation within the company. He began keeping detailed notes about the discrepancies he was observing, documenting instances where reported expenses didn't match actual expenditures, and tracking patterns that suggested deliberate falsification of financial records. His investigation led him to suspect that several senior executives at Consolidated Motors were involved in an embezzlement scheme that was siphoning money from the company's development budget into their personal accounts. The amounts involved were substantial, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, which represented a significant fortune in 1955 purchasing power. Robert faced an agonizing moral dilemma. If he was correct about the embezzlement, exposing it would be the right thing to do for the company's shareholders and employees. But making such accusations against senior executives would almost certainly end his career at Consolidated Motors and possibly damage his reputation throughout the automotive industry. Moreover, he had no concrete proof of wrongdoing, only suspicious patterns in financial reports that could potentially be explained by legitimate business practices he wasn't aware of. The pressure of this situation began to affect Robert's behavior at home. Catherine noticed that he had become increasingly withdrawn and preoccupied, often spending long hours in his study, poring over financial documents and engineering reports. He was sleeping poorly, and his usually hearty appetite had diminished noticeably. When Catherine asked him about what was troubling him, he would only say that he was dealing with some complicated issues at work that would hopefully resolve themselves soon. Catherine could sense that whatever was bothering her husband was more serious than normal workplace stress. She had lived with Robert long enough to recognize the difference between his usual professional concerns and the deeper anxiety that now seemed to permeate his daily life. She offered to help in any way she could, but Robert insisted that he needed to handle the situation on his own, and that involving her would only create additional complications. The strain began to affect their relationship in subtle but noticeable ways. Robert became less communicative during their evening meals, often lost in thought and responding to Catherine's conversation with distracted monosyllables. He stopped taking his usual pleasure in working on his Chevrolet, and their weekend drives through the countryside became less frequent as Robert claimed he needed to spend more time reviewing work materials. By October of 1955, Robert had decided that he needed to take action. He had spent months gathering evidence of what he believed to be systematic financial fraud, and he felt he had a moral obligation to bring his concerns to the attention of Consolidated's board of directors. He scheduled a meeting with the company's chairman for the morning of October 24th, planning to present his findings and request a thorough investigation of the financial irregularities he had discovered. The night before that fateful meeting, Robert sat in his study until well past midnight, organizing his documentation and rehearsing the presentation he would make to the chairman. Catherine had gone to bed hours earlier, and the house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional sound of a car passing on the street outside. Robert understood that the next day would likely change his life forever. If his suspicions proved correct, and the board took action based on his revelations, he would be remembered as the engineer who helped save Consolidated Motors from financial ruin. But if his accusations were unfounded, or if powerful forces within the company moved to silence him, his career and possibly his family's security could be destroyed. As he finally closed his files and prepared to go to bed, Robert had no way of knowing that he would never have the opportunity to make that presentation to the chairman. The events set in motion by his investigation had already begun to spiral beyond his control, and forces he had not anticipated were preparing to ensure that his discoveries would never see the light of day. The morning of October 23, 1955, dawned crisp and clear in Detroit, with the kind of brilliant autumn sunshine that made the city's tree-lined neighborhoods glow with golden light. Robert Hartley woke at precisely 6:30, as was his habit, and went through his morning routine with characteristic efficiency. He showered, shaved with his safety razor, and dressed in his best navy blue suit, the one Catherine had purchased for him at Hudson's department store for special occasions. Catherine was still sleeping when Robert went downstairs to the kitchen to prepare his breakfast. She was now 7 months pregnant with their second child, and the pregnancy had been more difficult than her first, leaving her exhausted and often nauseous in the mornings. Robert moved quietly through the kitchen, brewing coffee and toasting 2 pieces of bread, which he ate while standing at the window overlooking their backyard garden. The morning newspaper lay folded on the kitchen table, its headlines dominated by news of the Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union and President Eisenhower's latest policy initiatives. But Robert barely glanced at the front page. His mind was focused entirely on the day ahead and the momentous decision he had made to bring his suspicions about financial irregularities to the attention of Consolidated's leadership. At 7:15, Robert left a note for Catherine explaining that he had an early meeting and might be late returning home that evening. He kissed her gently on the forehead, careful not to wake her, and gathered his briefcase containing the carefully organized documentation he had assembled over the past several months. His hands were slightly trembling as he locked the front door behind him, and he took a moment to compose himself before walking to the garage. His black Chevrolet Styleline Deluxe started immediately, the engine purring with the smooth precision that resulted from Robert's meticulous maintenance. As he backed out of the driveway, he noticed Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor, retrieving her morning newspaper from her front porch. She waved, cheerfully, and Robert waved back, managing a smile despite the tension he was feeling. The drive to Consolidated Motors headquarters normally took Robert about 25 minutes through Detroit's morning traffic, but today he took a slightly longer route that allowed him to collect his thoughts and mentally rehearse once more the presentation he would make to Chairman Harrison Blackwell later that morning. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, which gave him time to review his materials once more and perhaps discuss his concerns with one or two trusted colleagues who might be able to provide additional perspective. Robert arrived at the Consolidated Motors building at 8:20, parking his Chevrolet in its usual space in the executive parking area. The building was a testament to the company's ambitions, a 12-story Art Deco structure faced with limestone and featuring elaborate bronze details that gleamed in the morning sunlight. As he walked through the marble-lined lobby toward the elevators, Robert nodded to the security guard and several early-arriving employees, maintaining his usual friendly demeanor, despite the knot of anxiety in his stomach. His office on the 8th floor overlooked downtown Detroit, with a view that included several other automotive company buildings and the distant Detroit River. Robert had always found this view inspiring, a daily reminder of the industry that had made Detroit the automotive capital of the world. But this morning, as he arranged his files on his desk and prepared for what might be the most important day of his professional life, the cityscape seemed somehow ominous, as if shadows were gathering despite the bright sunshine. At 8:45, Robert's secretary, Miss Patricia Coleman, arrived and immediately noticed his unusually serious demeanor. Patricia had worked for Robert for 3 years and had developed an almost uncanny ability to read his moods and anticipate his needs. She was a capable, discreet woman in her early 30s who had chosen career over marriage, unusual for the era, and Robert had come to rely on her organizational skills and sound judgment. "Good morning, Mr. Hartley," Patricia said, hanging her coat in the small closet beside her desk. "You're in early today. Should I bring you coffee?" "Good morning, Patricia. Yes, coffee would be wonderful. And please hold all my calls until after 10 o'clock. I have that meeting with Chairman Blackwell, and I need to focus on preparing for it." Patricia nodded, but Robert noticed a flicker of concern cross her face. In the 3 years she had worked for him, she had never seen him appear so tense before an important meeting. Usually, Robert approached even the most challenging professional situations with confidence and his characteristic calm, analytical approach. As Patricia busied herself with preparing coffee and organizing the morning's correspondence, Robert spread his documentation across his desk and began one final review of the evidence he had compiled. The patterns were clear to his engineer's eye: systematic discrepancies between reported project costs and actual expenditures, unexplained budget overruns that corresponded to no identifiable increases in project scope, and a complex web of vendor relationships that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify the flow of funds within the organization. At 9:15, Robert received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Brennan, Consolidated's vice president for finance, appeared in his office doorway with an expression that Robert couldn't quite read. Brennan was a heavy-set man in his late 40s, with prematurely gray hair and a reputation for being extremely detail-oriented in financial matters. He had always maintained cordial but somewhat distant relations with Robert, treating the engineering department as a necessary expense rather than a profit center. "Robert, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced," Brennan said, closing the office door behind him and taking a seat in one of the leather chairs facing Robert's desk. "I understand you've been doing some analysis of our development budgets and expenditures." Robert felt his pulse quicken. He had been extremely careful to conduct his investigation discreetly, accessing only financial reports that were routinely distributed to department heads. How had Brennan learned about his activities? "I do review budget reports regularly, Tom. It's part of my responsibility as Chief of Advanced Engineering to understand how our development dollars are being allocated." Brennan smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Of course. but I'm told you've been asking questions about some of our vendor relationships and payment procedures. I wanted to make sure you understand the broader context of some of these financial arrangements. For the next 20 minutes, Brennan provided what he characterized as clarification about Consolidated's financial practices, explaining that many of the apparent discrepancies Robert had identified resulted from complex accounting procedures required by the company's bank lending agreements and tax obligations. His explanations were detailed and superficially plausible, but Robert's analytical mind detected inconsistencies and gaps in the logic. "I appreciate you taking the time to explain this, Tom," Robert said carefully. "It certainly helps me understand the broader picture. I'm sure Chairman Blackwell will be interested in these details when I brief him on our department's budget utilization this morning." Brennan's smile faltered slightly. "Actually, Robert, I should mention that Chairman Blackwell had to cancel your meeting this morning. An emergency board situation came up that requires his immediate attention. I've taken the liberty of rescheduling you for next week." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. He had confirmed the meeting with Blackwell's secretary just the day before, and she had mentioned no possibility of a schedule conflict. Moreover, Brennan would not normally have authority to reschedule meetings for the chairman without explicit instructions. "I see. Well, perhaps I should check with Mr. Blackwell's office directly to arrange the new meeting time." "Oh, that won't be necessary," Brennan replied quickly. "I'm coordinating with his secretary to find a mutually convenient time. I'll let you know as soon as we have something confirmed." After Brennan left his office, Robert sat quietly for several minutes, trying to process the implications of what had just occurred. The timing of Brennan's visit, coming just hours before his scheduled meeting with the chairman, seemed far too coincidental to be innocent. Someone had clearly learned about his investigation and was taking steps to prevent him from presenting his findings to senior leadership. Robert realized that he might be in more danger than he had previously understood. If senior executives at Consolidated were indeed involved in embezzlement, they would have powerful incentives to silence anyone who threatened to expose their activities. His position as chief of advanced engineering, which had seemed to provide him with security and influence, might actually make him a target if he was perceived as a threat to ongoing criminal activities. At 10:30, Robert made a decision that would prove to be fateful. Rather than waiting for Brennan to reschedule his meeting with Chairman Blackwell, he decided to drive directly to the chairman's home in Bloomfield Hills to present his findings in person. If there were people within Consolidated Motors who were working to suppress his investigation, approaching Blackwell outside the corporate environment might be the only way to ensure that his concerns received a fair hearing. He gathered his documentation into his briefcase and told Patricia that he would be out of the office for the remainder of the day, handling a confidential matter that required his personal attention. Patricia offered to reschedule his afternoon appointments, but Robert told her to cancel them entirely, saying he wasn't certain when he would return. The drive from downtown Detroit to Bloomfield Hills normally took about 45 minutes through the northern suburbs, but Robert decided to take a more circuitous route that would allow him to think through his approach to Chairman Blackwell. He drove north through the city, then turned west on Grand Boulevard before heading north again on Woodward Avenue, one of Detroit's main arterials. As he drove, Robert noticed a dark blue sedan that seemed to be maintaining a consistent distance behind him, even when he changed lanes or adjusted his speed. At first he dismissed this as coincidence. There were thousands of similar vehicles on Detroit's roads, and it was natural that some would be traveling in the same direction. But as he continued north on Woodward, making several turns that a random driver would be unlikely to duplicate, the sedan remained in his rearview mirror. Robert's engineering training had taught him to be observant and analytical, and he began to pay closer attention to the vehicle following him. It appeared to contain two occupants, both wearing dark clothing and hats that obscured their faces. The sedan maintained a professional surveillance distance, close enough to keep Robert's Chevrolet in sight, but far enough back to avoid drawing attention. By the time Robert reached the outskirts of Bloomfield Hills, he was convinced that he was being followed. The implications were disturbing. It suggested that his investigation had attracted attention from people who were prepared to take extraordinary measures to monitor his activities. He began to wonder if his telephone had been tapped or his office searched, and whether other aspects of his personal life might be under surveillance. Robert made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to Chairman Blackwell's home, where his followers might interfere with his meeting or create a dangerous situation, he decided to drive to a remote location where he could confront his pursuers directly. He was tired of being watched and manipulated, and his engineering temperament demanded a direct approach to solving problems. He turned east on a rural road that led toward the less developed areas of Oakland County, where forests and small lakes dotted the landscape. The dark sedan followed, now making no attempt to maintain a discreet distance. Robert pressed his accelerator, and his modified Chevrolet responded smoothly as the speedometer climbed past 55 miles per hour. The two-car chase continued for nearly 20 minutes through increasingly remote countryside. Robert was a skilled driver who knew his vehicle's capabilities intimately, but his pursuers were equally determined and seemed to be operating a car that was well-maintained for high-speed driving. Neither vehicle gained a decisive advantage as they raced through the rolling hills and forest roads of rural Michigan. As the afternoon wore on, Robert realized that he was running low on gasoline and would need to either end the chase or risk being stranded in an isolated area. He also began to worry about Catherine, who would be expecting him home for dinner and might become concerned if he was extremely late without explanation. The confrontation that had begun as an attempt to face his followers directly was becoming dangerous and potentially pointless. Robert made one final attempt to lose his pursuers by turning onto a narrow gravel road that led deep into state forest land. His Chevrolet handled the rough surface well, its suspension soaking up the bumps and ruts while maintaining good traction. But the sedan behind him was equally capable, and Robert realized that he was only leading both vehicles deeper into an area where help would be impossible to find. As the sun began to set and long shadows stretched across the forest road, Robert found himself in a situation he had not anticipated. He was alone in a remote wilderness area, being pursued by unknown individuals who clearly had hostile intentions, with limited fuel and no realistic prospect of assistance. The careful analytical approach that had served him so well in his engineering career seemed inadequate to address the immediate physical danger he was facing. The chase ended when Robert's Chevrolet finally ran out of gasoline on a barely visible track deep in the forest. The engine coughed once and died, leaving Robert stranded in growing darkness with his pursuers somewhere behind him in the maze of forest roads. He gathered his briefcase and abandoned the vehicle, hoping to find shelter until dawn, and then make his way on foot to a main road where he could seek help. The investigation that had begun with Robert's desire to do the right thing for his company and its shareholders had evolved into something far more sinister and personal. As darkness fell over the Michigan forest, Robert Hartley was about to discover that some secrets are worth killing to protect, and that his commitment to honesty and integrity had placed him in mortal danger. The investigation into Robert Hartley's disappearance began within hours of his failure to return home on the evening of October 23rd. Catherine Hartley, now 7 months pregnant and caring for their 3-year-old son, Robert Jr., became increasingly concerned as the evening progressed without word from her husband. Robert was meticulous about his schedule and courteous about communication. It was completely uncharacteristic for him to be late without calling or leaving some explanation. At 8 o'clock that evening, Catherine telephoned Robert's secretary, Patricia Coleman, at her home. Patricia confirmed that Robert had left the office around 10:30 that morning, saying he would be handling a confidential matter and might not return that day. She had assumed he was attending an off-site meeting or conducting business somewhere outside the Consolidated Motors facility. Catherine's next call was to Thomas Brennan, Consolidated's vice president for finance, whose home number she obtained from the company directory. Brennan expressed surprise at Robert's absence and claimed to have no knowledge of his whereabouts. He mentioned that Robert had been scheduled to meet with Chairman Blackwell that morning, but that the meeting had been postponed due to a scheduling conflict. Growing increasingly worried, Catherine contacted Harrison Blackwell directly at his Bloomfield Hills home. The chairman was courteous, but claimed to have no information about Robert's plans for the day. He confirmed that their meeting had been canceled that morning due to what he characterized as urgent business matters requiring his attention. By 10 o'clock, with Robert still missing and no reasonable explanation for his absence, Catherine made the difficult decision to contact the Detroit Police Department. The desk sergeant who took her call was sympathetic, but explained that adults could not be reported as missing persons until they had been absent for at least 24 hours. He suggested that Robert might have been delayed by car trouble or an unexpected business obligation, and advised Catherine to wait until morning before filing a formal report. That night was one of the longest in Catherine Hartley's life. She sat in the living room of their Grosse Pointe home, alternately pacing and sitting in Robert's favorite chair, watching through the window for the headlights of his black Chevrolet. Every sound, a car door slamming in the distance, the wind rattling the windows, even the house settling, made her heart race with the hope that Robert had finally come home. Catherine called her parents and Robert's parents, hoping that he might have contacted them or stopped by for some reason, but neither family had heard from him. She also telephoned several of Robert's closest friends and colleagues, but none had seen him or knew anything about his plans for the day. As the hours passed, Catherine's initial concern evolved into genuine fear that something terrible had happened to her husband. The next morning, with Robert still missing and no word about his whereabouts, Catherine contacted the police again. This time, she was connected with Detective Lieutenant Frank Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the Detroit Police Department who specialized in missing persons cases. Morrison was a tall, thin man with graying hair and intelligent brown eyes who had seen enough human tragedy to approach each case with both professional skepticism and genuine compassion. Morrison arrived at the Hartley home at 10 o'clock on October 24th, accompanied by Detective Sergeant Anna Kowalski, one of the few female investigators in the department. Kowalski was in her early 30s, with short blonde hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that had earned her respect among her male colleagues. She had particular expertise in cases involving domestic disappearances and was skilled at interviewing family members and associates. The detective spent nearly 2 hours with Catherine, gathering detailed information about Robert's recent behavior, his work situation at Consolidated Motors, his personal relationships, and any unusual circumstances that might explain his disappearance. Catherine described her husband as a devoted family man and dedicated professional who had shown no signs of wanting to leave his family or abandon his responsibilities. However, she did mention that Robert had seemed unusually preoccupied and stressed in recent weeks, often working late in his home study, and appearing troubled by something he described only as complicated issues at work. She had assumed these concerns were related to normal business pressures and had not pressed him for details, respecting his need to handle professional matters independently. Detective Morrison was particularly interested in Robert's modified Chevrolet Style Line Deluxe, which Catherine described as her husband's pride and joy. She provided detailed information about the vehicle, its black paint, customized engine modifications, and distinctive Michigan license plate number. Morrison immediately issued a bulletin to all area law enforcement agencies, asking them to be alert for the vehicle and to report any sightings. The detective's next stop was Consolidated Motors Corporation, where they met with Chairman Harrison Blackwell and several senior executives. Blackwell portrayed Robert as a valued employee who had been under some pressure due to challenging engineering projects, but had shown no signs of personal or professional problems that might explain a sudden disappearance. Thomas Brennan, the vice president for finance, corroborated Blackwell's assessment and provided additional details about Robert's work responsibilities and recent activities. Brennan mentioned that Robert had been conducting detailed analysis of development budgets and expenditures, which was characterized as normal oversight activity appropriate to his position as Chief of Advanced Engineering. However, when Detective Morrison pressed for more specific information about Robert's recent work activities and any potential conflicts or controversies he might have been involved in, the company executives became noticeably less forthcoming. Blackwell explained that much of Robert's work involved proprietary technical information and confidential business strategies that could not be discussed with outside parties, even law enforcement officials. Patricia Coleman, Robert's secretary, provided the most helpful information during the initial investigation. She confirmed that Robert had seemed unusually tense on the morning of his disappearance and had specifically requested that all calls be held until after his scheduled meeting with Chairman Blackwell. She also mentioned that Thomas Brennan had visited Robert's office that morning for what appeared to be an unscheduled and somewhat urgent conversation. More significantly, Patricia revealed that Robert had been staying late at the office on several occasions in recent weeks, working with financial reports and documentation that he kept locked in his desk drawer. She had noticed him making copies of various documents and organizing files in a manner that seemed to go beyond his normal administrative duties. The investigation expanded over the following days to include interviews with Robert's colleagues, neighbors, and social acquaintances. A picture began to emerge of a man who was highly regarded professionally and personally, but who had been under increasing stress in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Several co-workers mentioned that Robert had seemed preoccupied and had asked unusual questions about company financial procedures and vendor relationships. Detective Morrison's experience in missing persons cases had taught him that unexplained disappearances often involved one of several common scenarios: voluntary departure due to personal problems, accidental death or injury, or foul play related to business or personal conflicts. Based on his interviews with Robert's family and associates, Morrison began to lean toward the theory that Robert's disappearance was involuntary and possibly related to his work at Consolidated Motors. The financial investigation aspect proved particularly challenging. When Morrison requested access to Robert's office and personal files at Consolidated Motors, the company's legal department intervened, claiming that the materials contained proprietary information protected by trade secrets. They offered to allow company officials to review the files and provide summaries of any relevant information, but refused to grant direct access to law enforcement. This resistance from Consolidated Motors raised red flags for the experienced detective. In his experience, legitimate businesses typically cooperated fully with missing persons investigations, especially when the missing person was a valued employee. The company's insistence on controlling access to Robert's work materials suggested they might have something to hide or were concerned about what those materials might reveal. Morrison obtained a search warrant for Robert's office, but by the time he was able to execute it, 3 days after Robert's disappearance, many of the files Patricia Coleman had mentioned had been removed. Company officials claimed that the materials had been transferred to other departments for ongoing project work, but they were unable to provide specific documentation about where the files had been moved or who had authorized their removal. The investigation took on additional urgency when Morrison learned from unofficial sources within the automotive industry that Consolidated Motors was facing serious financial difficulties that had not been disclosed publicly. Industry analysts were beginning to question the company's long-term viability, and there were rumors of internal management conflicts over strategic direction and financial management. Morrison began to develop a theory that Robert Hartley had discovered evidence of financial irregularities at Consolidated Motors, and that his disappearance was related to efforts to suppress that information. This theory was supported by Patricia Coleman's observations of Robert's recent work habits and his apparent stress in the days leading up to his disappearance. However, proving this theory would require access to Consolidated's internal financial records, which the company continued to resist providing. Morrison faced the frustrating situation of having reasonable suspicions about the motive for Robert's disappearance, but lacking the concrete evidence needed to compel full cooperation from the potential suspects. The search for Robert's black Chevrolet proved equally challenging. Despite the widespread bulletin to law enforcement agencies throughout Michigan and surrounding states, no reliable sightings of the vehicle were reported. Several false alarms led to wasted investigative time pursuing leads that ultimately proved to be cases of mistaken identity involving similar vehicles. Morrison expanded the search to include remote areas where a vehicle might be abandoned or concealed. Search teams combed through forests, ravines, and abandoned properties throughout southeastern Michigan, but found no trace of Robert's distinctive automobile. The detective began to suspect that the vehicle had been deliberately hidden or destroyed to eliminate evidence of what had happened to its owner. 3 weeks after Robert's disappearance, the investigation faced a major setback when key evidence began to disappear. Patricia Coleman reported that additional files from Robert's office had been removed, supposedly for routine archival purposes. Thomas Brennan, who had been one of the last people known to have spoken with Robert, suddenly became unavailable for further interviews, claiming to be hospitalized for a serious medical condition that his physicians said required complete rest and isolation. Most troubling of all, Chairman Harrison Blackwell announced that he was taking early retirement for personal reasons and would be relocating to Florida immediately. When Morrison attempted to schedule a follow-up interview, Blackwell's attorney informed the detective that his client would no longer be available for discussions about the Hartley case, and that any further inquiries should be directed through legal channels. The systematic removal of potential witnesses and evidence convinced Morrison that he was dealing with a well-organized cover-up involving multiple individuals within Consolidated Motors Corporation. However, the political and economic power of the automotive industry in Detroit made it extremely difficult to pursue aggressive investigative tactics against major corporate executives without overwhelming evidence of criminal activity. By December of 1955, the official investigation into Robert Hartley's disappearance had effectively reached a dead end. The Detroit Police Department kept the case open and continued to follow up on occasional leads, but Detective Morrison was reassigned to other cases, and the search for answers gradually lost momentum. Catherine Hartley, now dealing with the stress of her husband's disappearance while preparing for the birth of their second child, hired a private investigator to continue searching for answers. The private investigator, a former police detective named Samuel Walsh, pursued several leads that the official investigation had been unable to follow due to jurisdictional and resource limitations. Walsh's investigation uncovered additional evidence of financial irregularities at Consolidated Motors, including vendor payments that could not be accounted for, and development projects that appeared to exist only on paper. However, by the time he was able to document these findings, several key figures had left the company or moved out of state, making it impossible to pursue criminal charges. The birth of Catherine's second child, a daughter they named Susan, brought both joy and additional sadness to the Hartley family. Catherine faced the challenge of raising 2 young children while holding on to hope that Robert might still return home. Friends and family provided support, but the uncertainty about Robert's fate created a persistent shadow over their lives. As months turned into years, the Robert Hartley case joined the ranks of Detroit's unsolved mysteries. Occasional tips and sightings would generate brief renewed interest, but none led to concrete answers about what had happened on that October afternoon in 1955. The case file grew thick with reports, interviews, and investigative notes, but the central questions remained unanswered. Detective Morrison, even after his retirement from the Detroit Police Department in 1972, continued to think about the Hartley case. He maintained an unofficial file of clippings and notes related to the disappearance, and he would occasionally follow up on new information that came to his attention. In his opinion, Robert Hartley had been murdered because of what he had discovered about financial crimes at Consolidated Motors, but the evidence needed to prove that theory had been systematically destroyed or concealed. The mystery deepened over the decades as Consolidated Motors Corporation itself disappeared from the automotive landscape. The company filed for bankruptcy in 1961, and its assets were eventually acquired by larger automakers. Key executives from the 1955 era died or disappeared into retirement, taking their secrets with them. For nearly 7 decades, the fate of Robert William Hartley and his black Chevrolet Style Line Deluxe remained one of Detroit's most puzzling unsolved cases. Police files gathered dust in storage rooms, and even Robert's family gradually accepted that they might never learn the truth about what had happened to him. But forests keep their secrets differently than people do, and sometimes what has been hidden for generations can be revealed by the patient work of time, weather, and chance. The discovery that Sarah Chen and Marcus Thompson made on that foggy October morning in 2023 would finally begin to provide answers to questions that had haunted a family and baffled investigators for more than half a century. The decades following Robert Hartley's disappearance witnessed profound changes in both the automotive industry and the city of Detroit itself. The 1960s brought increased competition from foreign automakers, shifting consumer preferences, and social upheaval that would permanently alter the landscape of American manufacturing. Meanwhile, the mystery of what had happened to the young engineering executive and his black Chevrolet became part of Detroit folklore, whispered about in automotive industry circles, and occasionally featured in true crime publications that specialized in unsolved cases. Catherine Hartley faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding her life while raising 2 children as a single mother in an era when such situations were far less common and socially accepted than they would become in later decades. With help from her family and Robert's life insurance policy, she was able to maintain the family home in Grosse Pointe and provide stability for young Robert Jr. and baby Susan. However, the financial and emotional strain of her circumstances was enormous. Catherine never remarried, though she received several marriage proposals from men who were attracted to her beauty, intelligence, and the tragic romantic aura that surrounded her story. She later told friends that she had made a conscious decision to focus entirely on her children's welfare and to preserve the memory of her marriage to Robert. In her heart, she maintained hope that someday he might return with an explanation for his mysterious disappearance. Robert Jr. grew up with only fragmentary memories of his father, impressions of a tall man who smelled of cologne and motor oil, who would lift him high in the air and make airplane sounds, and who spent long hours in the garage working on the black car that became such an important element in the family's tragic story. As he matured, Robert Jr. developed many of his father's characteristics: a methodical approach to problem-solving, an aptitude for mechanical systems, and a quiet intensity that sometimes made him seem older than his years. Susan Hartley never knew her father at all, having been born 3 months after his disappearance. She grew up with stories about Robert told by her mother and grandmother, but these tales of a brilliant engineer who had vanished under mysterious circumstances sometimes seemed more like fairy tales than family history. Susan's childhood was marked by a persistent sense of incompleteness, as if an important piece of her identity had been removed before she was old enough to understand what was missing. The 2 children responded differently to their father's absence as they matured. Robert Jr. became fascinated by automotive engineering and detective work, as if he might somehow solve the mystery that had destroyed his family's happiness. He spent countless hours in the public library, reading about automotive history, criminal investigation techniques, and unsolved disappearances. By the time he was in high school, he had developed his own theories about what might have happened to his father. Susan, by contrast, seemed to want to distance herself from the family tragedy. She was an excellent student with interests in literature and the arts, and she rarely spoke about her father's disappearance even when directly questioned about it. Friends and teachers sometimes forgot that she was the daughter of Detroit's most famous missing person, which was exactly how Susan preferred it. Detective Lieutenant Frank Morrison, who had led the original investigation into Robert's disappearance, retired from the Detroit Police Department in 1972, but maintained an active interest in the case. Morrison had worked hundreds of missing persons cases during his career, but the Hartley disappearance continued to bother him in a way that few other investigations had. He was convinced that Robert had been murdered because of information he had discovered about financial crimes at Consolidated Motors Corporation. But the systematic destruction of evidence and the departure of key witnesses had made it impossible to build a prosecutable case. During his retirement years, Morrison continued to follow developments in the automotive industry and occasionally received calls from journalists or amateur investigators who were researching the Hartley case. He always cooperated with these inquiries, hoping that fresh perspectives might uncover new leads, or that changing circumstances might encourage someone with knowledge of the case to come forward. Morrison's retirement hobby became researching the financial history of Consolidated Motors Corporation and tracking the subsequent careers of the executives who had been with the company in 1955. What he discovered reinforced his suspicions about criminal activity within the organization. Several former Consolidated executives had gone on to prominent positions with other automotive companies, accumulating wealth that seemed disproportionate to their official salaries and known business activities. Most intriguingly, Morrison learned that Thomas Brennan, the vice president for finance who had visited Robert's office on the morning of his disappearance, had left Consolidated Motors just 6 months after the incident and had moved to California, where he purchased an expensive home in Beverly Hills and invested in several successful business ventures. The source of Brennan's apparent wealth was never clearly explained, and he consistently declined to be interviewed about his time at Consolidated Motors. The 1970s and 80s brought additional challenges to Detroit's automotive industry, with plant closures, massive layoffs, and the decline of several major manufacturers. Consolidated Motors Corporation, which had filed for bankruptcy in 1961, became a footnote in automotive history, remembered primarily for its association with the Hartley disappearance, rather than for any significant contributions to automotive technology or manufacturing. During this period, the case generated occasional renewed media attention. True crime writers would periodically revisit the story, usually as part of broader examinations of unsolved Detroit mysteries or automotive industry scandals. These articles typically rehearsed the known facts about Robert's disappearance, but offered little new information or insight into what might have happened. In 1985, 30 years after Robert's disappearance, the Detroit Free Press published a comprehensive retrospective article about the case. The newspaper's investigation uncovered some previously unreported details about the financial irregularities at Consolidated Motors and the systematic removal of evidence following Robert's disappearance. However, most of the key figures from the original investigation were either deceased or refused to be interviewed. The article did include an extensive interview with Catherine Hartley, who was now 58 years old and still living in the family's Grosse Pointe home. Catherine spoke candidly about the impact of her husband's disappearance on their family, and her continued hope that someday the truth about what happened would be revealed. She mentioned that she had kept Robert's personal belongings exactly as he had left them, including his home study with its technical books and engineering journals. Robert Jr., now 34 and working as an automotive engineer for General Motors, was also interviewed for the article. He expressed his belief that his father had been murdered because of information he had discovered about criminal activity at Consolidated Motors. Robert Jr. had spent considerable time researching the case on his own and had developed detailed theories about potential suspects and motives, though he acknowledged that proving his theories would be extremely difficult after so many years. Susan Hartley, who was pursuing a graduate degree in English literature at the University of Michigan, declined to be interviewed for the article. Through her mother, she expressed her appreciation for continued public interest in the case, but said that she preferred to focus on her studies and her future, rather than dwelling on family tragedy. The 1990s brought new technologies and investigative techniques that offered hope for solving cold cases like the Hartley disappearance. DNA analysis, computerized databases, and improved forensic methods had successfully resolved several decades-old mysteries, leading to renewed interest in applying these tools to unsolved cases from earlier eras. Detective Morrison, now in his 80s but still mentally sharp, worked with younger investigators to organize and digitize the extensive files related to the Hartley case. The hope was that computer analysis might reveal patterns or connections that had been missed during the original investigation, or that new forensic techniques might be applicable if physical evidence was ever discovered. The digitization process revealed the thoroughness of Morrison's original investigation and the systematic nature of the obstacles he had encountered. The files documented numerous instances where key evidence had disappeared, witnesses had become unavailable, or corporate legal departments had blocked access to potentially relevant information. Reading through the accumulated documentation reinforced Morrison's conviction that the investigation had been deliberately sabotaged by people with significant resources and influence. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Hartley case remained unsolved, but it continued to fascinate students of true crime and automotive history. Internet forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries frequently featured discussions about possible theories and potential new leads. Amateur investigators would occasionally contact the Detroit Police Department with tips or suggestions, though none led to significant breakthroughs. Catherine Hartley passed away in 2003 at the age of 76, having spent nearly half a century wondering what had happened to her husband. Her obituary in the Detroit newspapers mentioned her strength in raising 2 children as a single mother, and her dignity in dealing with one of Detroit's most publicized family tragedies. She was buried in the same cemetery where space had been reserved for Robert, though his body was never recovered. Robert Jr. inherited his parents' home and faced the difficult task of sorting through a lifetime of accumulated belongings, including materials related to his father's disappearance. He discovered that his mother had saved every newspaper clipping, police report, and investigative note related to the case, creating an archive that documented nearly 50 years of investigation and speculation. Among his mother's papers, Robert Jr. found several items that had not been included in the official police files, including personal notes that Robert Sr. had made in the weeks before his disappearance, and a partial draft of what appeared to be a report about financial irregularities at Consolidated Motors Corporation. These materials provided additional confirmation of Robert Jr.'s theory that his father had been investigating criminal activity and had been silenced to prevent him from exposing it. The discovery of these previously unknown documents led Robert Jr. to contact retired Detective Morrison, who was now 85, but still actively interested in the case. Morrison was excited by the new evidence and suggested that it might be worth approaching current Detroit Police Department investigators to see if the case could be reopened with fresh resources and modern investigative techniques. However, the practical challenges of investigating a 50-year-old case remained formidable. Most of the original suspects were now deceased, key witnesses had died or disappeared, and relevant corporate records had been destroyed or dispersed. Moreover, current law enforcement agencies faced resource constraints that made it difficult to dedicate significant attention to historical cases without compelling new evidence or clear prospects for resolution. Robert Jr. continued his private investigation throughout the first decade of the 21st century, using internet resources and genealogical databases to track down relatives of people who had been associated with Consolidated Motors in the 1950s. He was able to contact family members of several former Employees and executives, some of whom provided interesting anecdotal information about the company's internal culture and management practices. These conversations reinforced Robert Jr.'s suspicions about criminal activity within Consolidated Motors, but did not produce the kind of concrete evidence that would be needed to solve the case definitively. Several people mentioned rumors and suspicions that had circulated within the company, but nobody claimed to have direct knowledge of what had happened to Robert Sr. or his automobile. Susan Hartley, who had completed her graduate studies and become a college professor, remained largely uninvolved in these efforts to investigate their father's disappearance. She had made peace with the likelihood that the case would never be solved and preferred to focus on her career and her own family. However, she maintained cordial relations with Robert Jr. and supported his continued efforts to find answers, even though she did not share his optimism about the possibility of success. By 2020, 65 years after Robert Hartley's disappearance, the case had become a historical curiosity rather than an active investigation. Detective Morrison had passed away in 2018 at the age of 91, taking with him the most detailed knowledge of the original investigation. The Detroit Police Department's Cold Case Unit maintained the file and would follow up on any credible new leads, but the practical prospects for solving the case seemed increasingly remote. The automotive industry that had provided the context for Robert's disappearance had itself been transformed beyond recognition. Detroit had experienced decades of economic decline, population loss, and urban decay, though recent years had brought signs of renewal and revitalization. The major automotive companies had evolved into global corporations with operations throughout the world, and the connection between Detroit and automobile manufacturing was no longer as central to the city's identity as it had been in the 1950s. Robert Jr., now approaching 70, had retired from his engineering career and devoted increasing amounts of time to researching his father's disappearance. He had accumulated boxes of documents, photographs, and correspondence related to the case, and he had developed extensive theories about what might have happened and where his father's remains might be located. His research had led him to focus on remote areas of southeastern Michigan where a vehicle might have been abandoned or concealed. Using historical maps, aerial photographs, and geographic information systems, Robert Jr. had identified dozens of locations that seemed like plausible sites for hiding an automobile. However, the practical challenges of searching these areas were enormous, particularly given his advancing age and limited resources. It was during this period of focused geographic research that Robert Jr. began communicating with urban explorers and amateur historians who were interested in Michigan's hidden places and forgotten history. These contacts led to discussions with people like Sarah Chen and Marcus Thompson, who had both the interest and the physical capability to explore remote locations that might contain evidence related to his father's disappearance. The collaborative effort that developed between Robert Jr. and these urban explorers represented a new phase in the search for answers to the Hartley mystery. Modern technology, including GPS navigation, digital photography, and internet communication, made it possible to coordinate search efforts and share information in ways that would have been impossible during the original investigation. None of the participants in these searches expected to find definitive evidence of what had happened to Robert Hartley and his black Chevrolet. The case was simply too old, and too many opportunities for discovery had already passed. But the possibility of finding some trace of the missing man and his automobile provided motivation for exploring Michigan's wilderness areas and documenting the hidden history of the region. Sarah Chen and Marcus Thompson were among several teams of urban explorers who agreed to search specific grid coordinates that Robert Jr. had identified as potentially significant. Their expedition to the remote forest area in October 2023 was motivated by curiosity rather than by any strong expectation of making an important discovery. The morning when they stumbled upon the vegetation-covered automobile in the heart of the Michigan wilderness marked the beginning of the end of one of Detroit's longest-running mysteries. After nearly 7 decades of speculation, investigation, and hope, physical evidence was finally available to begin answering the questions that had haunted the Hartley family and fascinated observers of unsolved crimes. The discovery would prove that some secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, cannot remain concealed forever when persistent people refuse to give up the search for truth. The discovery of what appeared to be Robert Hartley's long-lost Chevrolet in the Michigan wilderness triggered an immediate and carefully coordinated response from multiple agencies. Sarah Chen and Marcus Thompson, recognizing the potential significance of their find, had made the crucial decision to photograph the scene extensively before contacting authorities. Their professional documentation would prove invaluable in the complex investigation that followed. Within hours of receiving Sarah's call, Detective Captain Jennifer Martinez of the Michigan State Police arrived at the remote forest location with a team of forensic specialists, evidence technicians, and search and rescue personnel. Detective Martinez had spent 15 years investigating cold cases and was well aware of the Hartley disappearance's historical significance in Michigan law enforcement circles. The logistics of investigating a crime scene in such a remote location presented immediate challenges. The nearest road capable of handling police vehicles was nearly a mile away, requiring all personnel and equipment to be transported through dense forest on foot. A temporary command post was established at the Forest Service access road, and a communications relay was set up to maintain contact with the investigative team at the discovery site. Detective Martinez's first priority was securing and documenting the scene before any evidence could be disturbed or contaminated. The automobile had been so thoroughly integrated into the forest ecosystem that removing vegetation and debris required extreme care to preserve any forensic materials that might have survived decades of exposure to weather and wildlife. The initial examination confirmed that the vehicle was indeed a 1951 Chevrolet Style Line Deluxe, matching the description of Robert Hartley's missing automobile in every significant detail. The license plate, though severely corroded and partially obscured by plant growth, was eventually confirmed to match the number that had been issued to Robert Hartley in 1955. More significantly, the position of the automobile suggested that it had been deliberately driven to this remote location, rather than abandoned randomly. The vehicle was located several hundred yards from the nearest forest road, positioned in a small clearing that would have been accessible only by someone with detailed knowledge of the area's terrain and vegetation patterns. Dr. Elena Sanchez, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Michigan, was called in to examine the automobile's interior for any human remains. The decades of accumulated organic debris, combined with the natural decomposition processes that would have occurred in Michigan's climate, made this examination extremely challenging and time-consuming. Working with painstaking care, Dr. Sanchez and her team gradually removed layers of leaves, soil, and plant matter from the vehicle's interior. The process revealed numerous artifacts that confirmed the automobile's connection to Robert Hartley. Personal items including a severely degraded wallet with fragments of identification, business cards from Consolidated Motors Corporation that were barely legible, and engineering documents that had been reduced to unreadable fragments by decades of moisture and decay. The most significant discovery came on the second day of excavation, when Dr. Sanchez located partial human remains beneath the accumulated debris on the automobile's floor. The bones were in a highly fragmentary condition due to decades of exposure to moisture, temperature fluctuations, and the acidic conditions created by decomposing organic matter, but sufficient material was recovered to confirm that they represented the remains of an adult male. Dental records, preserved in the Detroit Police Department's cold case files, provided definitive identification. The remains found in the automobile were those of Robert William Hartley, finally resolving the question of his fate that had persisted for 68 years. The discovery brought closure to a family mystery that had spanned 3 generations, while simultaneously opening new questions about the circumstances of his death. The forensic examination revealed evidence that fundamentally changed the understanding of what had happened to Robert Hartley in October 1955. Contrary to theories that he had been murdered elsewhere and his body disposed of, the evidence suggested that Robert had been alive when he reached this remote forest location and had died inside his automobile under circumstances that remain to be determined. Dr. Martinez Lopez, a forensic pathologist brought in to examine the skeletal remains, found no obvious signs of violence such as bullet wounds, blade marks, or blunt force trauma. However, the incomplete nature of the skeletal material and the extensive degradation that had occurred over decades made it impossible to rule out certain types of injury that might not leave distinctive marks on bone. The investigation expanded to include a detailed examination of the automobile itself for clues about what had brought Robert to this location and what had happened during his final hours. Forensic technicians carefully dismantled accessible portions of the vehicle, looking for evidence that might explain the circumstances of his death. The automobile's interior had been completely compromised by decades of exposure to the elements, making it impossible to determine fuel levels or mechanical conditions at the time of Robert's death. The engine showed extensive corrosion and damage from moisture and organic acids, eliminating any possibility of determining whether mechanical failure had played a role in stranding the vehicle. Inside the automobile's glove compartment, investigators discovered fragments of what appeared to have been documents, though the paper had deteriorated to the point where no readable text could be recovered. Chemical analysis of the fragments suggested they were consistent with 1950s-era paper stock, but no specific content could be determined. The investigation team also discovered personal effects that had survived the decades better than paper materials. A metal fountain pen engraved with Robert's initials was found beneath the driver's seat, along with the corroded remains of what appeared to have been a wristwatch and several coins dated from the early 1950s. More significantly, forensic examination of the area immediately around the automobile revealed evidence that supported the theory that Robert had not died immediately upon reaching the location. Soil analysis indicated human activity in the immediate vicinity of the vehicle, suggesting that Robert had spent some time outside the automobile before returning to it, possibly seeking shelter or attempting to signal for help. The investigation of the forest area around the automobile revealed additional evidence that supported the theory of Robert having been pursued to this location. Search teams discovered what appeared to be the remnants of old campsites several hundred yards from the Chevrolet, including rusted metal objects that might have been cans or cooking utensils, though these could not be definitively dated to 1955. More significantly, metal detector sweeps of the area located several items that appeared to date from the 1950s era, including what may have been rifle cartridge cases, though their connection to the Hartley case remained speculative due to the extensive deterioration that had occurred over decades of exposure to forest conditions. The discovery of Robert Hartley's remains and automobile generated intense media attention, both locally in Detroit and nationally, among observers interested in cold cases and unsolved mysteries. The story had all the elements that fascinate the public: a decades-old mystery, corporate corruption, dramatic pursuit through wilderness areas, and a family that had never given up hope for answers. Robert Hartley Jr., now 70 years old, finally received the closure he had sought for his entire adult life. While the discovery confirmed his worst fears about his father's fate, it also vindicated his belief that Robert Sr. had been a victim rather than someone who had voluntarily abandoned his family. The evidence of his father's courage in investigating criminal activity provided some comfort amid the sadness of learning about his death. Susan Hartley, now a retired college professor, was more ambivalent about the discovery. While she appreciated having definitive answers about her father's fate, the revelation of the circumstances surrounding his death reopened emotional wounds that she had spent decades trying to heal. She expressed gratitude for the efforts of the urban explorers and investigators who had finally solved the mystery, while also noting the sadness of learning that her father had died alone and afraid in the wilderness. The investigation into the corporate corruption that had apparently motivated Robert Hartley's disappearance faced significant challenges due to the passage of time. Consolidated Motors Corporation had been defunct for over 60 years, and most of the executives, who had been with the company in 1955, were now deceased. However, the historical record provided valuable information about corporate fraud in the automotive industry during the post-war boom years. Historians and economists who examined the available documentation found evidence of sophisticated financial schemes that had been used to divert funds from automotive companies' development and manufacturing budgets during the 1950s. The methods used were remarkably advanced for the era and provided insights into the evolution of corporate financial crime. The revelation that Robert Hartley had likely been murdered to conceal corporate corruption added his name to the unfortunately long list of whistleblowers who have paid the ultimate price for trying to expose wrongdoing. His case became a subject of study for researchers interested in corporate ethics, whistleblower protection, and the historical development of white-collar crime investigation techniques. Detective Captain Martinez's investigation remained officially open, though the practical prospects for identifying and prosecuting Robert's killers were extremely limited. The people who had been directly responsible for his death were almost certainly deceased after 68 years, and proving their involvement would require evidence that was unlikely to still exist. However, the case provided valuable lessons for current investigators about the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining long-term perspectives on unsolved cases. Modern forensic techniques had made it possible to extract information from evidence that would have been considered worthless in 1955, demonstrating the value of maintaining cold case files even when immediate solutions seem impossible. The discovery of Robert Hartley's automobile also highlighted the changing relationship between human civilization and the natural environment. The forest that had concealed his Chevrolet for nearly 7 decades had been gradually incorporating the evidence of human activity into its organic systems, creating a unique archaeological site that demonstrated how nature reclaims human artifacts over extended periods. Environmental scientists studied the site to understand how forests integrate foreign materials and how human artifacts can become part of natural ecosystems over time. The automobile had become a habitat for various plant and animal species, creating a complex, microenvironment that had evolved over decades around the original structure. The case also demonstrated the power of modern technology and social media in solving historical mysteries. The collaboration between Robert Hartley Jr. and urban explorers like Sarah Chen and Marcus Thompson had been facilitated by internet communications and digital mapping technologies that allowed coordinated searches of remote areas. Without these modern tools, Robert's automobile might have remained hidden in the forest for many more decades. As the investigation concluded and the media attention gradually subsided, the Hartley case took its place among the resolved mysteries of Detroit's automotive era. Robert William Hartley was finally laid to rest beside his wife Catherine in a ceremony that attracted hundreds of people who had followed the case over the decades or who had been inspired by his courage in trying to expose corporate corruption. The black Chevrolet Style Line Deluxe, after serving as evidence in the investigation, was carefully restored by automotive historians and is now displayed in a Detroit museum as a memorial to Robert Hartley and a reminder of the human costs of corporate crime. The forest location where it was discovered has been preserved as a historical site, marked with a plaque that honors Robert's memory and acknowledges the decades-long efforts to solve the mystery of his disappearance. The resolution of the Robert Hartley case after 68 years stands as testament to the power of persistence, modern technology, and the refusal of family members and investigators to abandon hope for justice. While the passage of time had made it impossible to prosecute the people responsible for Robert's death, the discovery of his remains and the revelation of the circumstances that led to his murder provided closure for his family and valuable lessons for future generations about the importance of corporate accountability and the protection of those who have the courage to speak truth to power. In the end, the Michigan forest that had kept Robert Hartley's secret for nearly 7 decades had finally given up its mystery, proving that even the most carefully concealed crimes cannot remain hidden forever when dedicated people refuse to stop searching for the truth. The case serves as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed by decades, can eventually prevail when evidence is preserved, stories are remembered, and investigators maintain their commitment to uncovering the facts, no matter how long the search may take.